This was perhaps the most people's limousine in the history of the Soviet Union. A government car, originally intended for top officials, was formally available for public sale and considered accessible to any Soviet citizen. At least, that was how it looked on paper. But what was the catch? Today, the story of the Soviet Union's most people's limousine, the GAZ-12 ZIM. In the Soviet Union, passenger cars were broadly divided into two categories: vehicles for private ownership and vehicles intended for state organizations. There were exceptions, however, when cars from the second category could be purchased by wealthy private individuals. This was the case with the post-war Pobeda and later with two generations of the Volga. In the first years after World War II, the Soviet Ministry of Automotive Industry was under pressure to rapidly cover the country's basic needs for passenger cars. For ordinary citizens, this role was assigned to the Moskvich 400, a localized version of the Opel Kadett, whose production line had been taken from defeated Germany. The Gorky automobile plant, however, was given far more ambitious tasks. Its first major project was the M20 Pobeda, a car that proved difficult to bring to maturity. Early production was plagued by design flaws and manufacturing issues, so serious that production had to be halted for almost a year to address them. Another project was a new off-road vehicle, which later entered production as the GAZ-69. At the same time, the party leadership required a new representative car, one that would be more prestigious than the Pobeda, but not as luxurious as the ZIM limousines, reserved for the highest levels of power. Engineers at GAZ received the assignment to develop a six-seat sedan in the spring of 1948. They were given just over 2 years to complete the entire project, an extremely tight deadline, fully understood by the plant's chief designer, Andrei Lipgard. One option would have been to follow a familiar path and simply copy a contemporary American car, something the Soviet industry had done more than once, and often successfully. Lipgard, however, chose a different approach. The decision was made to maximize technical commonality with existing GAZ models, limiting new development primarily to the body and a small number of components. The problem was obvious. GAZ did not yet have a suitable engine for a car of this size and weight. The only engine that could even theoretically suit the new car was a six-cylinder unit producing 70 horsepower, originally used in GAZ trucks. It worked well enough in slow-moving trucks, but for a heavy six-seat sedan it was clearly underpowered. Developing a new engine was out of the question. There was neither the time nor the resources. As a result, the choice came down to two options: significantly boosting the existing engine or achieving a substantial reduction in vehicle weight. The second, more ambitious path was chosen. Weight reduction was pursued by abandoning the traditional frame and switching to a unibody construction. It was a bold decision. A 5.5-meter-long four-door body with rear-hinged doors still had to maintain sufficient structural rigidity. To test the layout, the interaction of key components, and the behavior of the extended unibody structure, a special prototype was built. It was based on a production Pobeda, whose body was artificially lengthened by inserting an additional section between the front and rear doors. The exterior design was developed by sculptor Lev Yeremeyev. In the Soviet system, there was no profession of automotive designer. This role was performed by technical artists and sculptors. As was often the case, American cars served as a reference point. This time the inspiration was the 1948 Cadillac Fleetwood. The ZIM was not a direct copy, but the resemblance is immediately apparent, which is why it is often referred to as the Soviet Cadillac. At the time, every new car was shown to Stalin before entering series production. He either approved the launch or pointed out flaws, after which the car was sent back for further work. And this was certainly not a formality. Stalin reviewed such projects carefully and often quite critically. The most famous example is the story of the Kim 10. Its approval turned into a long and stressful ordeal, during which the car's designers were put under serious pressure. There is already a video about that story on the channel. I'll leave a link in the pinned comment. The acceptance of the Pobeda was not entirely smooth either. The ZIM, however, made a very different impression. Stalin liked the car, and after a short test drive, he spoke about it surprisingly warmly, even praising its creators. And that reaction is easy to understand. Despite the obvious influence of American cars, the ZIM's design turned out to be well-balanced. As intended, it looked noticeably more prestigious than the Pobeda. And even against the backdrop of the rapidly aging ZIM limousines, it still appeared modern. Official approval was granted on June 14, 1949, and full-scale production began on October 13, 1950. Achieving a truly radical reduction in weight ultimately proved impossible. The ZIM's curb weight stood at 1,940 kilograms, noticeably higher than originally intended. Even after being uprated, the engine produced 90 horsepower, allowing the car to reach 100 kilometers per hour in 37 seconds, with a top speed of 120 kilometers per hour. By any measure, these were modest figures, especially for a car of this class. In the context of Soviet cities in the 1950s, however, this was hardly a serious drawback. Traffic was minimal, and the ZIM was almost never stopped by the police. On largely empty streets, it felt perfectly at ease. The GAZ-12 ZIM was equipped with a 3-speed manual transmission, but in character, it was very different from the manual gearboxes most drivers were used to. Its defining feature was a fluid coupling, based on design principles borrowed from American cars of the late 1940s. After production began, the GAZ-12 ZIM quickly became an object of desire for its intended audience. This group included mid-level officials, directors of large factories and enterprises, regional party functionaries, as well as senior military and police officers. In short, those for whom the GAZ-110 was still out of reach by status, while the Pobeda already felt too modest and no longer matched their position. Demand far exceeded supply. There were many more officials eager to move up from the Pobeda to the ZIM than the factory could possibly build. As a result, distribution followed a familiar Soviet pattern. First, the limousines went to the capitals, then to major cities, then to smaller ones, and further down the chain, even to provincial towns, if someone there qualified for such a car. Yes, the notorious Soviet shortages and waiting lists existed here as well. The situation was further complicated by the fact that not all ZIMs went to officials at all. A portion of production was diverted to various organizations and services. As early as 1951, a medical version of the ZIM entered production. Its rear passenger area was replaced with space for a stretcher, which was loaded through the trunk lid, a highly unusual solution for a sedan body. This was neither a mobile intensive care unit nor an ordinary ambulance. Medical ZIMs operated only in major cities and served exclusively high-ranking patients. Even so, the concept proved viable. Another service that effectively intercepted a share of ZIM production was the taxi fleet. Formerly, these cars were no different from ordinary taxis. They ran on standard fares and enjoyed no special privileges. In practice, however, ZIM taxis were almost always assigned to so-called showcase routes, areas frequented by foreigners and party officials. These included hotels, airports, railway stations, and resort towns. Still, under the right circumstances, a ZIM could pick up an ordinary passenger. If the car had just delivered a foreign visitor from the airport to a hotel, and locals asked the driver to take them back to the airport or a train station, such a ride was possible. Trips to residential outskirts, however, were usually out of the question. But the very fact that an ordinary worker had a real chance to sit in the back seat of a ZIM mattered in itself, and it was more than enough to warm the soul of a Soviet citizen. But perhaps what should have warmed the soul of the Soviet worker the most was something else entirely. At least on paper, there was a possibility to buy a ZIM for private ownership. Of course, assuming one had the money, and that sum was not just high, it was enormous. The GAZ-12 cost roughly 4 times as much as a Moskvich, which, at a price of about 9,000 rubles, was already out of reach for most citizens. In that context, the ZIM was almost beyond discussion. High price, however, was not the only obstacle. Even with the money in hand, one could not simply walk in and buy a ZIM. An informal approval from the authorities was required. Officially, no special permits existed, but in practice, the buyer's finances were quietly scrutinized. Put simply, the state wanted to know where that kind of money came from. Had the citizen, for instance, sold state secrets to foreign spies and now decided to spend the proceeds on a limousine? Obviously, that's a joke. But the reality was no less revealing. ZIMs were sold into private hands only to a very narrow circle of people. primarily prominent figures from culture, theater, and cinema, and in some cases, high-ranking generals. In essence, the GAZ-12 ZIM served as a kind of demonstration of accessibility. Unlike the ZIZ-110, which was never sold to private individuals at all, the ZIM could, at least formally, be purchased. This is precisely why it earned the image of a people's limousine, an image that has survived to this day. And yet, from another angle, the picture looks quite different. The car was technically on open sale. If you had the money, you could come and buy one. The fact that the overwhelming majority of the population did not have that money was only natural. Executive cars have never been accessible to everyone, anywhere, at any time, only to the very wealthy. So the question remains open. Was the ZIM truly a people's limousine, or merely a successful piece of propaganda? There is, in fact, plenty to argue about here. The first, and essentially the only, so-called people's Soviet limousine was taken out of production in 1960. There were a few attempts to modernize it, but by the late 1950s, it had become clear that a car of this design was not only outdated, it was virtually impossible to develop further. It was a vehicle of a fading era. At the same time, a replacement for the ZIM was being prepared long before it left the production line. In 1957, the GAZ-13 Chaika entered production, a car of the same executive class, which gradually began to push the ZIM out of the garages of mid-level officials. The ZIM itself was removed from the capital and reassigned to regional and provincial institutions. A simple Soviet limousine cycle, from the center to the periphery, and eventually into history.